This is Alan Conway. Over a period of several years, he successfully tricked hundreds of people into giving him free stuff by pretending to be the legendary director Stanley Kubrick. Now, right out the gate, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, that guy looks absolutely nothing like Stanley Kubrick. Did he wear a fake beard, or make some kind of mask, or conceal his face in some way? No, he did literally nothing at all to change his appearance. So how on earth did this whole thing happen? Well, it's important to understand that Alan Conway was a compulsive liar. He was born in London in 1934 as Eddie Allen Jablowski, so even the name Alan Conway was a lie. At the age of 13, he was caught stealing money and clothing and was sent to what the British called Borstal, which is basically juvie but more evil. And it only made him continue his lying ways. He would often tell people he was a Polish Jew who had been in a concentration camp. In reality, his parents were Polish, but they had moved to England before he was born. By the time he was an adult, his compulsive lying was so ingrained in his personality that he changed his name to Alan Con, which is a bit like the guy who wrote Silence of the Lambs naming the cannibal character Hannibal. You really had to dig deep to come up with that one, huh? And even Alan Con was a bit too on the nose for him, so he eventually lengthened it to Alan Conway. And when I say Alan Conway was a compulsive liar, I mean he was literally addicted to lying no matter what the consequences were. And there had been plenty of consequences. Aside from several arrests in England for false pretenses, he was also arrested in Switzerland and Australia. That last one resulted in him getting 3 months in prison before the Australians deported him, at which point he moved to Ireland, where he was arrested again and given 6 months of hard labor. Although 6 months of hard labor for the Irish is equal to about 1 honest day's work for the rest of us. He returned to England, where he was arrested again and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The French also gave him 4 years in prison for swindling, but he had already fled the country by then, so it was basically meaningless unless he couldn't resist the call of a fresh croissant. But by 1971, it seemed the old dog was ready to settle down. They always say the first 37 years of your life are the messing around years before it's time to get serious. So Alan Conway married a woman in England, and the two of them opened a travel agency and had a son together. And for several years, everything was relatively fine. But unfortunately for his wife, Alan Conway was a closeted gay man. And while he had been sneaking out for the occasional tryst during his marriage, everything came to a head in the late 80s, when Conway decided he couldn't live like this anymore. So he left his wife and shacked up with a man. And once again, everything was relatively fine. Well, not for Alan's wife and son, but for him. Sadly, at some point around 1990, Alan's lover died of AIDS. The whole thing sent Conway into a deep depression, and he quickly became an alcoholic. And when his travel agency collapsed, the only thing left to do was come out of liar's retirement and start scamming people again. And he quickly discovered the perfect character to play, the famous director Stanley Kubrick. Which brings us back to the question, why would you pick someone who looks nothing like you? Well, the thing that's important to know about Stanley Kubrick is that he was incredibly reclusive. In fact, he seemingly didn't leave the UK at all after the age of 30. Some people attributed this to a fear of flying, but maybe he just couldn't get enough of those beans. In 1978, he and his wife purchased an 18th century stately home called Childwickbury Manor. Kubrick used this manor as his home and also his production studio, meaning he pretty much never left the house unless he was on set. As a result of this, the public kind of had no idea what he looked like. I mean, they had a general idea, but by the early 90s, he hadn't really been seen in 15 years. So a lot of people were quick to believe that Alan Conway was truly a clean-shaven Stanley Kubrick. So how exactly did the scam work? Well, since nobody really knew what Kubrick's personality was like, Conway could basically bring his own twist to the character. So instead of being a private recluse, he imagined Stanley as a gregarious charmer who would proudly introduce himself to people and talk at length about his life. He did kind of put on an accent to portray the American director, but it was reportedly a half-assed transatlantic accent. "Oh, my voice? I must have picked it up on the set of Barry Lyndon." After getting to know his victims, Conway would eventually make them promises about putting them in a movie or funding their creative pursuits, as long as they could be so kind as to buy him a drink or pay for his meal or perhaps have sex with him. So these were usually pretty short-term scams to get one thing out of the victim and move on before they realized that Stanley Kubrick probably did not sound like a 1920s radio host. But Conway did string along some people for longer. Among them was the English singer Joe Longthorne. He met Conway while on tour and truly believed that Stanley Kubrick was going to put him in a movie and get him a Las Vegas residency. Because everyone knows that nothing gets done in Vegas unless you run it past old Stanley first. Longthorne was so enthralled that he let Conway join him on tour, paid for him to stay in the nicest hotels, and covered the food bills too. This lasted about a week before Longthorne's manager made some calls and figured out that the American director was not currently accompanying a B-list cabaret singer on tour. After finding out about this, Longthorne's entourage allegedly threw Conway off a pier, but it was going to take more than that to stop the great Kubrick doppelganger. And while Stanley Kubrick was a slow, meticulous director who waited years between each film, his impersonator was extremely prolific, sometimes scamming multiple people a day. And because of the frequency, it wasn't long until the real Kubrick found out about it. It was May of 1991 when Kubrick's assistant, Anthony Frewin, received a call from a fashion designer in Brighton who was begging to get in touch with Stanley, insisting that they were close friends who had been to each other's homes. Frewin asked Stanley about it, only for the director to confirm that he had never met this person in his life. Kubrick said to Frewin, "He obviously met some idiot pretending to be me," and the two of them moved on. But it was only 10 days later that they received their second report of the fake Stanley. And soon enough, there were people flooding Anthony Frewin's phone with desperate pleas to get in touch with Stanley after he had supposedly befriended and then abandoned them. There was a rocker from London who quit his day job because Stanley had promised to get him a record contract in America. There was a Nigerian man who was convinced Stanley Kubrick was going to bankroll his all-black stage production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Then there was the owner of a gay bar who had declined someone's offer to purchase his bar because he believed Stanley would be buying it instead. And there was even a male prostitute in Amsterdam who had moved to England to console Stanley on the death of his son under the belief that Stanley would be buying him a house. But while Conway was carelessly lying his way around the globe for money and company, there was one victim who did come back to bite him. The American writer Frank Rich, who was then the New York Times head theater critic nicknamed the Butcher of Broadway, was eating dinner in a London restaurant in 1993, and Conway happened to be at the table next to him. Our old trickster was in the midst of conning Sir Fergus Montgomery, a British Tory MP who was a closeted gay man. But after a few drinks, Conway listened in on Frank Rich's conversation and figured out who he was. He walked over to their table, introduced himself as Stanley, and said that he was considering suing the New York Times for calling him a recluse. Glad he was defending Kubrick's honor while he was in character. Frank Rich and his group were stunned to have met Kubrick and asked if they could interview him for the paper. So Conway wrote down his number and told them to call him in a few days before he drunkenly walked away. None of the group really knew what had just happened, but they all agreed that Stanley Kubrick was definitely gay. Still, Frank Rich was a bit suspicious, so he called Warner Brothers, who put him in touch with Anthony Frewin. At this point, Kubrick and Frewin had been desperately trying to put a stop to Conway's antics. They spoke to an attorney, who told them that prosecuting him for this would be incredibly difficult. So Frewin had been personally investigating Conway, finding out who he was through information from Conway's victims. Frewin even found out that Conway lived next to one of his old friends, so he had his friend send him regular reports on Conway's activities. By the time Frank Rich called, Frewin had assembled an entire dossier on Alan Conway, and they decided to use Frank's platform to their advantage. On August 15, 1993, Frank Rich published an article in the New York Times called Stanley, I Presume, in which he retold his experience of meeting Alan Conway. This article was reprinted in a national UK paper, and even though Frank Rich never mentioned Conway by name, probably to avoid a lawsuit, it was enough publicity that Conway's con was way too big to continue. Not long after the article's release, one of Conway's victims reported him to the police. In the midst of one of his scams, Conway had signed a lease for a gay bar in Stanley Kubrick's name, which is fraud. So the police turned over Conway's apartment and arrested him. But even with his back against the wall and with a crippling alcohol addiction, Alan Conway had one more trick up his sleeve. When he was released on bail, he checked himself into the psych ward of a local hospital, claiming that the whole Stanley Kubrick thing had been the result of a mental breakdown. And it actually worked. The police dropped the charges when they realized he was insane, and Alan Conway was free to go. Shortly after his release, journalists showed up at his apartment to interview him. And in classic Conway fashion, he agreed to any interviews as long as they would pay him. Conway told the world that he really did believe he was Kubrick for a time, and that the whole thing had bankrupted him since everyone was always expecting Kubrick to pick up the check. The director's burden. He even appeared on TV, which is where we get the one picture we have of him. Of course, now that the word was out, he couldn't really keep pretending to be Kubrick. And after the public lost interest in his story, Alan Conway had nothing left to do but check himself into Alcoholics Anonymous. And while it seemed like he was ready to turn over a new leaf, it was later discovered that he told everyone in AA that he was a wealthy businessman from the Cayman Islands. They say the first step is admitting you have a problem, and the second step is admitting that the fictional character you invented for yourself has a problem too. A few years later, in Childwickbury Manor, Stanley Kubrick unexpectedly passed away at the age of 70. As the world mourned his death, one journalist went to Conway's apartment to hear his thoughts, only to be greeted by Conway's son, who told him that Alan Conway had died 3 months prior, forever cementing their spiritual link, which Kubrick would certainly want nothing to do with. In his will, Conway left £30,000 to a friend of his, and the rest of his money to his son. The only problem was that he had no money at all. In fact, he actually owed that friend £30,000, and it being referenced in the will was basically a joke. It's nice that he could laugh about these things. He also left his son with several £1,000s of credit card debt and an unpaid phone bill from talking on gay call lines. Thanks, Dad. But despite abandoning his family and leaving his son with negative money, Alan Conway's legacy lives on. Shortly after Stanley Kubrick died, his wife Christiane received— damn, good for him. His wife received a letter from an elderly couple expressing their sympathy, but then informing her that her late husband had once seduced their son and was actually a sleazy gay man freeloading his way around England. Conway's son received similar messages on his dad's answering machine from various people threatening to get revenge for what Stanley Kubrick had done to them. Kubrick's assistant, Anthony Frewin, later turned the whole thing into a movie starring John Malkovich called Color Me Kubrick, which nobody watched, probably much like this video. But perhaps that's the best way for a man like Alan Conway to live. For it was only when he was shrouded in such anonymity that his greatest art could be created. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll throw you off a pier.